Thomas Potter has a message for us. On the shores of Good Luck, New Jersey, yes, that's what that little hamlet was called. Just amazing, called Good Luck, New Jersey. He built a church with no minister, no congregation at all, just a hope for a theology more loving and more forgiving than one he had ever known. He was illiterate, so he could not express the theology he so deeply desired to understand. This is not a story of how one man hit the books and became learned so he could be a preacher of a radically loving new theology. No, it's not that story. This is the story of a man who built the house for love and then let love step in. He created the conditions for something holy to enter without knowing if it would ever come. God was his guide and his affirming redeemer in his work. We have the reverse experience of these hardy early Americans. We have the congregation and we have the theologians and the message. We have each other. We lack a church building, though. Thomas Potter has a message for us. What is guiding our work? This congregation has gone through scary times before and hard times. You have suffered great losses in your community. What has gotten you through it back then? And what will we lean on now, in this moment? And for you in your own life, perhaps there is something new you need to manifest. A vision is brewing, but you have not yet built a house for it in your heart. Perhaps you have drawn your plans, you've taken your measurements, and it is time to build something, ever so humble. And then when that house is sturdy, something new will come from across the ocean. It just needs your hopeful voice to speak it into existence. This is how miracles happen. One of the other heroes of our story, John Murray, founder of American Universalism, found his guide in an itinerant preacher named James Relly back in London in the mid-1700s, before he ever came over. After a Methodist schism over in England, James Relly led an innovative theological platform proclaiming Christ's unity with humankind and in his death, full grace for all. James Relly always denied that by enlarging the extent of the atoning grace of Christ's death that he had become a universalist. This was sort of a bad word at this time. However, his followers understood themselves to be universalists. Meanwhile, John Murray, a devout Calvinist preacher from Ireland, wrote in his autobiography that he had learned of a woman who he admired from his own congregation, a woman of irreproachable life, remarkable piety, and highly respected. Well, she had joined Relly's congregation, believing that she had been ensnared by a deceiver and blasphemer, and certain that he could convince her of her error. He led a small group to pay her a call. So there was a little crowd of them. After exchanging pleasantries, and this woman wasn't in the earlier story, this is another sort of chapter, she expounded on Relly's reasoning, leading Murray on a lengthy, breathtaking syllogism about salvation and belief. And its essence, if Jesus is not the Savior of unbelievers, then isn't asking them to believe in him a lie? And if you were once a non-believer, did he never die for you until you believed? Confounded and embarrassed into silence, Murray took his leave. From this period, he wrote, I myself carefully avoided every universalist. And yet, with the help of his wife, Eliza, he increasingly found his fellow ministers' arguments around Rellyism hollow, and he was drawn to learn more. He read Relly's major treatise, Union, more than once, about the union of Christ with humanity, and we went to hear him preach, and before long, he was attending regularly and became a disciple of Relly's. Murray gave an account of one of Relly's worship services in his autobiography. There were no seats save a few benches, and the pulpit was framed of a few rough boards over which no plane had ever passed. I think that means it was unsanded, right? The audience corresponded with the house. They did not appear to be very religious. That is, they were not melancholy. And therefore, I suspected they had not much piety. I attended to everything. The hymn was good, the prayer excellent, and I was astonished to witness in so bad a man such apparent devotion. In so bad a man. The Universalists were not somber like the Methodists, nor pained like the Calvinists. They were lively and warm of spirit. Can you imagine? Soon after John Murray's conversion, the life he had known fell apart completely. You remember that chapter. His young wife and their 1-year-old son soon became ill and died, as did his 3 sisters and his brother. He had what you would call a Job moment in his life. He fell into debt. He fell out with family and religious colleagues who opposed his new views. He was depressed, and this did not make it into the children's story, but he considered suicide, and eventually decided to go to America, leaving his old life behind, including religion. Well, we know how that turned out. The ship that he had taken to New York was grounded in New Jersey and unable to get off the next morning's tide. So he was wrecked onto Thomas Potter's property. This is our Universalist miracle story. Nobody walks on water or turns bread into fish in this miracle, but here we have 2 men who let hope and love be their guides. Thomas Potter builds a church on a New Jersey coastline and simply waits for someone to come and preach a loving God and not an angry, punishing God. And then we have the newly converted preacher, John Murray, depressive, tired of being misunderstood, grieving his dead family and all the fulfillment he had been promised earlier in his life. Landing on the shores of American wilderness, a stranger in a strange land. And yet, he was recognized. Thomas Potter saw the preacher in him. The miracle was the force of love that brought these 2 people together so they could recognize each other, complementary visionaries, seekers of a loving God. That holy synchronicity. Have you ever felt that? Like you were meant for something or meant to meet someone, and that meeting held a purpose you could not understand. Has someone ever recognized something in you and built a platform so you could do your bold new thing in this world? In your life, you have known someone who loved you, who saw something special in you. These people who see more in us than we can even understand, they are our guides. And also, perhaps you have known someone, you have recognized something in them they could not fully understand. And in that way, in that holy miracle, you were their guide. You showed them the way. You built the church in their heart. Mary Oliver, who died last week, writes about the earth as God's body. In her poems, she frames attention as devotion, with the natural world as her guide. She writes in her poem Turns, "The years to come, this is a promise, will grant you ample time to try the difficult steps in the empire of thought where you seek for the shining proofs you think you must have. But nothing you ever understand will be sweeter or more binding than this deepest affinity between your eyes and the world. The flock thickens over the rolling salt brightness. Listen. Maybe such devotion, in which one holds the world in the clasp of attention, isn't the perfect prayer, but it must be close. For the sorrow whose name is doubt is thus subdued, and not through the weaponry of reason, but of pure submission. Tell me, what else could beauty be for? Faith is like this. A walk on a beach without purpose becomes a destiny fulfilled by a flock of terns who have a message just for you. What else could beauty be for? Our devotion is our guide. In these times, we must be selective about what draws our attention. Universalists across history will tell you, let love be the guide for you. And so I let love be my guide when I too watched the iconic image of this last week, a mob of white teenage boys in red hats that read, "Make America Great Again," smirking and mocking the Native American elder Nathan Phillips in the National Mall. When I saw that image, I tried out a new exercise. Instead of reacting and staking my claim in the argument, I waited for love to appear. NBC News interviewed the Native elder Nathan Phillips, and every time the journalist asked him about his experience on the National Mall that day, he responded by talking about his faith. He said, I asked Creator God to protect me and stand with me and witness what was happening. When I put myself in prayer and used the drum to reach God, that mass of young men surrounded me and the folks that were with me. And when I was in prayer, I wasn't trying to stop anything, but I was spiritually moved to stay in the center of that whirlwind. Though none of the boys have offered an apology to Nathan Phillips, he has forgiven them. In truth, this incident was essentially people expressing themselves, however irresponsibly, on the National Mall, which is an appropriate national platform for public expression. Ideas and people have clashed in that space for decades and decades, and they will continue to do so for decades to come. Some commentaries have accused social media for creating a good and an evil narrative out of this moment. And I know we talk often of outrage fatigue. But where some people saw performative outrage against that white boy's smirk, I saw love in the outrage. The outcry against the boys' taunting mockery was an expression of love and hope for our country. In the outcry, I was grateful for the mass outrage of Americans who could not stand to see such unrelenting racist sneers in our youth. I saw revolutionary love rise up against such blatant disrespect. Those boys' faces and their mob mentality are triggering and terrifying for people of color and women. Now, I know the details are complex. I know this man, Nathan Phillips, approached the boys with the intent to confront them, and there are probably layers of truth beneath this brief analysis. But it is clear to me, these boys lack a true guide in their lives. And so out of that void, they rely on fear and disdain of something beyond their understanding. They have bought into a white supremacist narrative that demands they sell off a piece of their humanity. And it is only love that can call them back. My favorite Universalist sermon is Mark Morrison Reed's sermon titled, "Dragged Kicking and Screaming into Heaven." It's possible he's given that sermon to this congregation a few years ago. Mark Morrison Reed says Universalism's insight is that you cannot coerce people into loving one another. The commandments are not threats. If they are not fulfilled, God will not withdraw a love that is all-encompassing. No one has or will ever draw true love out of another with punishment. God's love is given to all and is a more positive force for good than fear will ever be. Love is not just stronger than fear. It is stronger than death. Now listen. Love survives in us. Thus, all the departed reside in us. Behind this is a simple truth. In being loved, we learn to love. Those who are loved will in turn love others. Those who feel God's infinite love or community's infinite love within themselves will feel so good about themselves, so connected to life, so full of compassion that they will not be able to help but spread that love. They will overflow with love. It will be brimming out of them. And now I'm going to say the word love a lot of times. Because I couldn't find a better word. I was looking for other euphemisms and metaphors, and it doesn't exist. So I'm going to ask you to join me in the sermon now, so I don't have to say it alone. Because you know what I mean, right? In being loved, we learn to love. And Jesus told us to love thy neighbor as thyself, which means we must learn first to love ourselves. Love, like we are all on a plane that just took a nosedive, and we have to put the oxygen mask of love onto ourselves before we can love others. Thomas Potter built a house for love on that shore. We're going to say it a lot more times, so I really got to hear you. He built a house for love on that shore. We must build a house for love in our hearts. We need to take down the walls on our borders. We need to take down the walls in our hearts and love ourselves first. This is no easy task, but with love as our guide, we can show ourselves compassion too. We can laugh at all the ways we fall short. You know, these boys are not lost causes at all from that moment on the National Mall. They can be loved into their own humanity. We can love ourselves even if we fall short. And once you have love for you, then you can be that guide that we all so desperately need in this broken world. Amen. May it be so.